name of Councillor Rebecca Moynihan.
Okay. I have a written request from Councillor Moynihan, who is not here, but she has given me a written request to allow Councillor Parodi to move her motion, so I'm going to allow Councillor Parodi to move the motion.
Yeah, I was just formally going to move the motion.
Lord Mayor, sorry Councillor Parodi. Our group will be putting an amendment to the motion, so guide me through that.
I'm going to take the amendments now in a minute. We'll just get the motion and a seconder for the original motion.
Yeah, I just formally moved the motion. Thank you.
We have a seconder?
Seconder for that. Councillor Paddy Burke seconding the motion.
Okay, I'm going to take the amendments in the order of receipt just to get them all out. So I have an amendment in the name of Councillors Breed Smith and Councillor Pat, seconded by Councillor Pat Dunn. It reads as follows. Delete third point, i.e. notes the evidence from Sweden to organised crime, and delete the last sentence calling for legislation criminalising the purchase of sex. That's the amendment from, that's the first amendment. There's a second amendment in the name of Sinn Féin Group.
Lord Mayor, the Sinn Féin amendment is as follows, and it's in the name of Councillors O'Toole, Dálig, McGrattan, McDonough and Conaghan. That this council recognises that the trafficking of women and girls for sex... Sorry, Lord Mayor. The amendment is as follows. Number 1, to replace clear in paragraph 3 with anecdotal. Number 2, to delete paragraph 5, notes the evidence from Sweden and would show that criminal sanctions for the purpose of sex are a proven deterrent to prostitution and consequently to trafficking and organised crime. And 3, amend last sentence to read, the City Council also supports the introduction of legislation criminalising the purchase of sex in Ireland. Delete as follows, in order to curb prostitution and trafficking for sexual exploitation.
Okay, so all amendments are in order now. Councillor O'Toole is circulating a copy of the Sinn Féin amendment. Councillor Smith, have you circulated a copy of the... Yeah. No, I have Councillor Montague was first to indicate. Councillor Montague. So she's just moving it, she doesn't want to speak. Councillor Montague. Any other speakers? Councillor Smith? Go ahead, Councillor Montague.
Okay, well, I reject the two amendments that are put there, because I think it's very clear from any of the research that's done into prostitution that the prostitution very badly damages the vast majority of women involved. And often a lot of prostitutes would have alcohol or drug problems, and it's been shown in research that the emotional and physical difficulties of being a prostitute exacerbates these problems, and those that have addiction issues, often their addictions get worse as a result of prostitution, and those that have no addiction often end up with an addiction. It's such a difficult and traumatic lifestyle. And trafficking is a huge issue. The majority of prostitutes in Ireland are from outside of Ireland. So it's a huge issue of trafficking, and I think most people would agree that that's a horrific lifestyle to bring somebody from another country to make them a prostitute here in Ireland. And anybody who had seen the horrific documentary in prime time on the lives that these women endure would surely agree that this is something that we have to change our attitude to and do something different. And what's happening in Sweden is something that's very positive, where they've had serious reduction in the levels of prostitution, unlike other countries that have a bit more benign attitude to it. And there is a belief that maybe we'll push prostitution underground, but the reality is there's always levels of prostitution that's more above ground, and some prostitution that's more underground. And if you make it more legal, you're just allowing a bigger variety of options for people there, unfortunately. So I would strongly agree with Councillor Rebecca Moynan's motion and would reject the amendments that have been put down for the sake of those people forced to endure this horrific lifestyle.
Okay, I have Councillor Smith, Quigley, McCartan, McGinley, McLaughlin and O'Toole.
Okay, I just want to first of all congratulate Councillor Moynihan for tabling this motion. It's an important discussion, and also to admire her patience, because we've been waiting months and months, as you'll see, from all the crossed out numbers on the amendment I've sent around. But she's lucky hers wasn't ruled out of order like mine was when I waited months and months. Anyhow, I just want to respond to what's been said here. If you read the motion and then read our amendment to it, really the essence of what we're getting at is not that we favour either trafficking or prostitution, but rather to make an argument that criminalising the purchase of sex doesn't deal with trafficking itself, because the way it's been framed by both Councillor Moynihan and Andrew there is it's assuming that all prostitution is equated with trafficking, and it's also assuming that trafficking is synonymous with the sex industry. And both of those things are not true. It is absolutely true there are lots of foreign people, not just women, but boys and men as well, working in the sex industry in this country, but they're not all necessarily trafficked. And it's also true that there are many people trafficked who don't work in the sex industry, who are working as slaves in mushroom farms and other kind of labour, you know, black labour and hidden jobs. So if the issue here is about trafficking, and we have laws in this country since 2008, the Human Trafficking Act, is not the argument to put the resources of the Gardaí, the very limited resources, and we're watching them being ever shrinking, given all the debates that are going on at the moment with the cutbacks, is not the argument or the debate about putting the very limited resources of the Gardaí into dealing with trafficking, rather than criminalising the purchasers of sex. Because I think what this does is that it makes prostitution a criminal issue rather than what it is, which is an economic and a social issue. It's been a social issue for decades, in fact for centuries in the world, and it's an economic issue because mostly those who engage in it do come from poverty, from addiction and all the stuff that Andrew so well described. But there is a problem with it, because if you begin to criminalise the purchaser of sex, the seller of the sex is driven underground. They are required, for example, to give evidence against the purchaser. Often they're searched and find condoms on their personal belongings. That's used as evidence that the guy they were talking to was about to purchase sex off them. Often they have to deal very quickly with a client, so they can't make a judgment whether that client is safe or not safe. And I really reject the quote of the Swedish model. You will know from, and I'm sure Rebecca knows this from doing her MA in it, the Swedish model is extremely controversial, and many states like Quebec, New South Wales and even Britain have rejected it as being the way forward. Decriminalising prostitution and going after the traffickers is a much more sensible way of dealing with this issue, and I think that the amendments reflect that much better than the total of the motion. I agree with most of the sentiment of the motion, but the amendment gets to the essence of whether we're talking about dealing with trafficking or dealing with prostitution as a social and economic issue or a criminal issue.
Thank you. Councillor Quigley.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, and again to congratulate Councillor Moynihan for putting the issue on the agenda. And again, the first part of the motion that refers to trafficking, I think we'd all agree that the strongest possible action needs to be taken around the issue of trafficking. If our current limits, if they're based, they could be based either on the legislation not being strong enough or on the resources not being adequate. And I think we'd all agree that we should look at which of those, it could be either or both of those elements needs strengthening, and I think everybody would support that. However, I would take issue with the final sentence in the motion, and for that reason I'm supporting the amendment from Councillors Smith and Dunn, because there's a lot of evidence we need to consider that in fact criminalisation, it doesn't actually, it reduces the visibility of sex work, it doesn't reduce the incidence of it, and in fact it puts the sex workers themselves at greater risks and make them more vulnerable. And in terms of when I'm talking about this, my knowledge of the issue is based on my experience relating to the issue of HIV. A lot of the work in this area internationally has been done by international HIV organisations. Sex workers are one of their key target groups, and the protection of those workers who are very vulnerable people is one of the key aims of the international HIV organisations, and they've done a lot of research into this, and they've looked at experience right across the world. Sweden is often quoted, it's one example, and in fact the evidence from Sweden shows there was an initial decrease in the official figures, as always happens with criminalisation, but the numbers, it doesn't reflect an actual decrease in the incidence of sex work, and the numbers are going back up again. But I'd refer particularly to a 2010 report. The UN AIDS Advisory Group on Sex Work produced a report in 2010, and the overall conclusions from that, and they looked, as I say, at experience right across the world in relation to sex work and the risks for sex workers, and concluded there is no evidence that initiatives that criminalise clients reduce sex work or improve the quality of life for sex workers, and they strongly recommended that states should move away from criminalising sex work or activities associated with it. And they talked about the persistent confusion between trafficking and sex work, which leads to laws that have a negative impact. And again, the Global Commission on HIV and the Law says the same, recommends that governments all over the world start abolishing punitive laws. So I think, based on the extent, we need to consider this issue much more in much more detail and take into account the range of international evidences there. And just a final point, I think that the Department of Justice actually should be congratulated for the consultation process they recently had around this issue. It was a very good consultation process, and one of the interesting things that happened was, for the first time, we had a number of sex workers actually became directly involved in the consultation and expressed their views, and generally their views would be very much against any kind of further criminalisation, because they, more than anybody else, knows it will impact on them in the end. So I think there is a lot of evidence that would show that this motion, the second part of this motion, would have the opposite effect to what it intends, and for that reason I would support the amendment from Councillors Smith and Dunn. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor McCartan.
Thanks, Lord Mayor. I think the one thing you can say is the conclusion of most of these reports are contradictory in their findings, because the Swedish example that I've looked at, where it suggests that most Swedish people are happy with what has happened, the changes that were brought about 12 years ago. Now, possibly it's a Swedish solution to a Swedish problem, like we have Irish solutions to Irish problems, because, to my mind, possibly a lot of the Swedish, the issue has gone underground, and this is always the danger. But when I'm looking at issues like prostitution, there was a very interesting programme yesterday evening, Miles Dungan's The History Show, and it related to Dingle back 300 years ago, and where he was talking about pirates and the 17th century and brothels operating with impunity. Prostitution was rife. So really nothing changes through the centuries. It will always be with us. But I think that this issue should be looked at from a female perspective. That's why I'm disappointed with the Sinn Féin motion there that says that it is very damaging for men and women involved in prostitution. Well, now, I would have thought if you're trying to look for support on that amendment there, you would mention more women than men. And it's one of those issues. Maybe it's why in Sweden that they took a more progressive stance on this, in terms of their initial attitude was because women were in a position in government to change things, where 50% of the elected members in Swedish Parliament are women, and the impetus for this seems to be coming from the Nordic countries, where women have a far more majority role in Parliament. So in this instance I would defer to the views of women, and I know Councillor Moynihan has had this item on the agenda. I was divided about it, but looking at the other amendments, I would actually support the motion as proposed by Councillor Moynihan. Thank you.
Point of order, Councillor Two. Councillor Two, that's not a point of order. You're coming back in shortly. You're coming back in shortly, so you'll be in a minute. You can correct that. Okay. Okay, Councillor McGinley.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. I'd have to tell you, I welcome the fact that the motion has come in front of us. I'd also have to say that the amendments that's been tabled by Councillors Smith and Councillors Dunn, I'm in support of that amendment because I think it clarifies a couple of key questions. I don't think it is clear that criminal sanctions, as quoted, have had the effect that is stated. So I think there is an amount of literature on that. So I think we're better off ignoring that. And equally, I think having more criminalisation, I don't think is going to do a lot for anyone. I think the point of the motion is just in terms of trying to be clear as between trafficking and prostitution is that we're trying to deal with people who find themselves actually trafficked in Ireland and who ultimately end up being abandoned and they then find that they have no prospects of becoming citizens. So I certainly do think that the point of the motion that citizenship needs to be made available to people, I think that is an important practical point. The Gardaí do currently have powers under the legislation. Certainly the evidence to date is that there's been very little activity underneath that heading, so there's the need for more action. I note what Councillor Quigley has said in terms of recent consultation, and there is evidence that the Minister for Justice does have some proposals in this area, so I certainly welcome that they would move forward. So in conclusion, Lord Mayor, I'd commend the amendment as given by Councillors Smith and Dunn. Thank you.
I have Councillor McLaughlin, Councillor O'Toole, Councillor Dunn and Councillor O'Callaghan.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. I'd like to commend my colleague Councillor Moynihan on this motion. I think that one of the crucial things about this motion is shifting the burden of the law towards the purchasers of sex rather than those working in the sex industry. That this is a kind of legislation which, if enacted, would cut down on some of the most damaging aspects of prostitution in Ireland. It would rebalance the power play more in favour of the sex worker rather than the client, criminalise the client and reduce demand, and also criminalising the client will reduce the amount of curb crawling and similar behaviour where ordinary women out in the wrong area of town are just seen as potential clients and get quite a lot of hassle in certain areas of the city that aren't, and it's quite an unacceptable face of things. And I think by criminalising the purchaser of sex, we will be altering people's behaviour in a way that will make the city a safer place for all, and particularly for vulnerable women. Thank you.
Councillor O'Toole.
First of all, I was going to make it under point of order. What Councillor McCartan referred to was actually a line from Councillor Moynihan's motion. If you go down to sentence 2. Sentence 2 is a line from the original motion. So that's not our amendment at all, Councillor McCartan. You had me slightly confused there for a moment. I want to commend the Councillor for bringing this motion. I think it's well worth discussion and debate here, and maybe it's about time. I think we all agree, definitely we all agree, of the horrible nature of the sex industry and how women are exploited in that. But however, having said that, we cannot just assume that one fell swoop is going to bring this to an end. I think there are flaws in it as regarding that. In our amendment, we ask to delete paragraph 5 where it's using the Swedish model. And I just want to and some other people may have made this point, there is really no proof of a deterrence in Sweden. Because all that can be argued, Lord Mayor, is that there has been
a decline in street prostitution. This is probably not even due to the law of criminalising people who use prostitutes. Street prostitution, Lord Mayor, has declined all over Europe in that same period, probably due to the growth of the internet, where it is much easier to access prostitution through the internet. Some of it obviously would be down to the law, there's no doubt about that, but it hasn't stopped. It has probably moved indoors, and the answer is even the Swedish government, Lord Mayor, can only say they haven't detected an increase in indoor prostitution, but they haven't done any actual research to establish this either. Also, there is no evidence that the law deters trafficking. Swedish police reports prove that trafficking is a growing problem, and the two largest sex trafficking rings in Swedish history were prosecuted last year. So it's ongoing, Lord Mayor, and I'll wind up in just 1 second, Lord Mayor, if you bear with me. Yes, sorry, Lord Mayor.
Answer two. Are you finished?
Notes here, Lord Mayor. I agree. We do need effective and appropriate responses to deal with these things. And consultation is underway on possible changes, as far as I know, to the prostitution laws. I do not think we should preempt this process. Lord Mayor, just say one final thing. There are young women forced into prostitution through drug addiction, through poverty, and there are some women who actually adopt prostitution as a lifestyle and as a way of earning money. Distasteful and horrific as it may be, there are women who actually take that choice. Thank you, Lord Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Dunn.
Lord Mayor, thank you very much. We've had plenty of time to consider this motion. It's been on the agenda for a number of months. And I'm not going to talk on the moral side of prostitution or otherwise, but the motion as was put to us quotes the Swedish model. If you do a little bit of research and you look at what's happening in other countries, New Zealand, for example, which I'm just going to speak about for a little bit, a country similar in size, population, and to a large extent culture to Ireland, even though it's on the far side of the world, legalised prostitution in 2003. They legalised brothel keeping. They legalised all aspects of prostitution. They clearly continue to oppose all forms of human trafficking. Since then, that allowed those who are working in the sex industry, for example in New Zealand, to form collectives, legal collectives, that are funded by the Department of Health of New Zealand to ensure that there's proper programs in terms of health and safety issues among people engaged in the sex industry. That seems to work well for those people in New Zealand. More importantly, it has meant that countries where prostitution has been driven underground means that those unfortunate people who might find that they're walking there but don't particularly aren't doing it. I don't believe too many people would walk in that industry as a lifestyle choice, but they're more protected. For example, in 2009 in New Zealand, a police officer who had been blackmailing a prostitute into her giving him free sex was prosecuted and jailed. That particular woman was able, under the legislation that had legalised prostitution, to take that case. If the Swedish model was imposed, for example, you would have a situation sort of where a vulnerable woman like that would not have been able to take a case like that because it just wouldn't have been possible. And the last point I want to make, and if you bear with me, Lord Mayor, when we talk about criminalisation, as far as I know, it is a criminal act for a person to purchase drugs, not just to sell drugs. That has not solved the drug problem in this city. Thank you, Lord Mayor.
Councillor Callahan.
Thanks, Lord Mayor. I think there's a lot of very valid points that have been made in Councillor Moynihan's motion and in the amendments that have been put in by Sinn Féin and Councillors Smith and Dunn. I suppose my concern in respect of Councillor Moynihan's motion arises because of the 3 bullet points that are in the middle of it. Aside from the 3 bullet points, I would be happy to support all other aspects of Councillor Moynihan's motion. But I suppose the thing that concerns me about the bullet points is that first bullet point notes there is clear evidence of children who have been trafficked in Ireland, specifically for the purpose of prostitution. Now that may be the case, but I'm not aware of that evidence and it hasn't been presented to me here. So I'm slightly worried about voting for something which seems to suggest that I'm aware of evidence of this, and I haven't, and maybe I should be, but I haven't. And I suppose the other concern I have is in respect of the evidence from Sweden. I don't know enough about the Swedish model that has been discussed here, and so I wouldn't feel really confident in voting in such a way to give support to that, since I don't know enough about it. But I would support Councillor Moynihan's motion if the 3 bullet points were taken out. I think we have to recognise as well that we're never going to get rid of prostitution. We could certainly cut down considerably on trafficking, but I think it's worthwhile, and as Councillor Dunn mentioned earlier, I always look upon prostitution in similar ways you look upon drugs. There are very valid arguments to be made on the drugs debate that maybe drugs should be legalised, and I'm sure there are valid arguments suggesting that prostitution should be legalised. I actually don't support those arguments, although there are valid arguments that can be made. But I think ultimately the reason I don't support it in respect of prostitution is that at the heart of prostitution is a really degrading treatment of women particularly, but also some men, particularly who are being used by other homosexual men. That is really degrading to an individual. They don't opt for it, in my opinion. I think no person would make a voluntary choice to get into prostitution. And I think it should be the case, like it is in drugs, that if you do engage in acts of prostitution, it seems unfair that only one party is being criminalised, the prostitute. It's like sort of if you bought drugs and the only person who was to be criminalised was the drug dealer. The drug purchaser is criminalised. I don't see any reason why the person buying prostitution shouldn't be similarly criminalised if we're going to have a criminal network around prostitution. Thanks.
Final speaker, Councillor Tormey.
Thank you very much, Lord Mayor. I find myself opposed to this motion. I think this motion panders to serious prejudice. I think the last speaker was entirely wrong when he said that no person could make a voluntary decision to enter prostitution. I think that's just clearly wrong. I believe that this motion and all such behaviour in Sweden interferes with the principle of adult autonomy. It interferes with adult autonomy in the same way that the criminalisation of homosexual acts interfered with adult autonomy. The question of trafficking is a separate issue entirely. It's quite clear that anybody who's been forced to do anything in any manner of slavery is having their human rights interfered with. And I, for one, would be very much against that. And that is illegal and is still illegal. What I think should happen is that there should be a licensing of the sex trade. I think that it should be confined to certain areas so that people's cultural distaste for prostitution could be catered for so that it doesn't happen in the house next door to you. And I quite frankly don't think it's anybody's business what people do with themselves when they're not forced into doing it. That is an entirely separate argument. It's also very tut-tut and silly that you want to kind of go down the Swedish road on this stuff, because you will never, as Larry O'Toole has said, get rid of prostitution. Whether prostitution is a good or a bad thing in certain circumstances is in the eye of the beholder, because it seems to be something that adults around the world get involved in voluntarily. There's male and female homosexuals. It is true that in conventional Christian, Judeo-Christian cultures, it is regarded with distaste. And I think at the end of the day, it would be far better to do one of two things: to legalise it preferably, or to ignore it as a second choice.
Okay, that's that's all the speakers. I'm going to let the proposers back in to respond to the debate. Councillor Perot, you moved to the first one. You don't have to respond. Do you want to come back in? Okay. Well, would you want to respond on it? Yeah, okay. Go on.
Just the notion that if we criminalise, that we'll be pushing things underground. There's always an underground prostitution, even if it's criminalised or not. And what happens, the reality is, though, if it's criminal across the board, well, let me put it the other way. If it's decriminalised, you'll get regular sex will be available for sale. And then what becomes underground gets the more extreme and nastier and more damaging sex goes underground. Whereas if you criminalise it, what tends to be underground tends to be the more normal and less damaging sex. So by having it, if you don't criminalise it, you'll have more dangerous underground sex happening, and that's what's happened in other countries. So that's why I think it is important to criminalise. If you normalise it, what goes underground is worse than what we consider the normal sex. And Dr. Tormey, I have to disagree with you because this is just something of choice, because the vast majority of people are in this out of desperation, not out of choice. There might be some people, but it's very much a very small minority. It's desperation that are forcing most people into it. It's not choice that are forcing most people into it. So that's why I believe that the other thing is that in Sweden, it's not about criminalising the prostitute. It's not about making life harder for the prostitute. It's about changing the balance. It's about criminalising the purchaser, and that protects the prostitute, and that's been successful in Sweden. And also at that conference in Ireland, there was prostitutes on both sides of that argument for Ireland. In Ireland, prostitutes from Ireland who do favour the Swedish model.
Councillor Smith, do you want to respond as an amender?
Thanks, Lord Mayor. Just very briefly, I don't think there's any evidence that by criminalising the purchase of sex that you somehow enhance the lives of those who are forced into prostitution or those who do it by choice. I think the evidence is the opposite. The weighted evidence is in the opposite direction. And I would also like to say that, this idea that if you decriminalise it, regular sex will be available everywhere. It's available everywhere anyway if you want to buy it. I walked down O'Connell Street a few weeks ago and there was guys, begging everybody to come into this joint on Eden Quay. And when my partner queried them, what can you get? You can get anything you want. And they were very unambiguous about that. And I'm sure it's quite true. It's for sale and it's there and they're not making any secret of it. The point, however, is if you criminalise that and make it illegal and make it a crime that sends people to jail or that takes their liberties away from them in some way, shape or form, you harm the sex worker. You don't help them. But let me go back to my original point, which was that this motion, through the Turn Off The Redlight campaign, and Ruhama and Rebecca quotes them in her motion, was to deal with the question of trafficking, which is obscene. But criminalising the purchase of sex doesn't deal with the question of trafficking. Put it to you simply, if there was laws passed tomorrow to criminalise the purchasers, the resources of the Gardaí would be put into chasing the purchasers of sex instead of chasing the geezers who are trafficking men and women, children in and out of the country. And I think we have a Human Trafficking Act 2008. If there's any emphasis to be put on this, the resources of the system of justice and the Gardaí should be put into dealing with that, rather than making what is a social issue a criminal one. And that's why I would urge people to support this motion, and I would urge Sinn Féin to drop their amendment, because they're actually supporting the motion by pushing the amendment for criminalising, their last sentence criminalises the purchase of sex as well.
Councillor O'Toole, do you want to respond as a proposer for Sinn Féin? Your amendment? Okay. Manager? We're just going to take them in the order received. So the first amendment will be the amendment in the name of Breed Smith and Pat Dunn. That will be taken first. If that is carried, Amendment 2 falls. Okay? If that is carried, then we take the second amendment, etc. Okay, Manager.
So the amendment proposed by Councillor Breed Smith and Councillor Pat Dunn provides as follows. Delete the third point, i.e. notes the evidence from Sweden to organised crime. So that's actually the third bullet point in the Councillor Moynihan's motion. And to delete the last sentence of that motion, starting with the words, this City Council down to trafficking and sexual exploitation. So those in favour of that amendment, please raise your hands. Those against? Abstentions? The vote for the amendment is 18 for the amendment, 14 against and 4 abstentions, so the amendment is carried. We now move on to motion number 32 in the name of Councillor Kieran Perry.
Thanks, Lord Mayor. It's so long ago since